Joining me live now is former Labor advisor and now at Counsel House. He's a political consultant. His name is Tom Cameron. Good to see you, Tom. Looking in the context of what we've just seen in the US and now moving into the Victorian election, it might seem like a pretty long bow here, but it does show you that there are a fractured politics on both sides. I mean, there's the latest polling that shows in the upper house, at least, more people are looking to minor parties. There's a lot of grievances. They're on all sides, but grievances are pretty serious in politics. How do the parties deal with them?
Good morning, Laura. Yeah, look, you're right about grievances being pretty serious. The reality is in politics, you know, all grievances are frankly legitimate in any liberal democracy, of course. You point to the US. I mean, I think one of the things that was really interesting about the recent midterm elections was how independent voters, so that's those that are not either Democrat or Republican aligned or registered voters, the independent bloc of voters in the US went right against the grain of the last 20 years or so and actually backed the president's party. Just so in effect, despite having some concerns about President Biden and him not being particularly popular, you saw independent voters in the recent midterms back the Democrats to the point of about a swing of 2%, whereas in almost every other midterm election over the last 20 years or so, you've seen independent voters actually go against the president's party to the order of anywhere between 12 and 20%, which is a lot. Now, what does that tell us? Is that it's really demonstrating to us that, you know, this new politics, and indeed one of the candidates in the Victorian state election just referred to this briefly, the new politics that we're seeing globally, not just here in Victoria where I am, but globally, is seeing independent voters become increasingly, influential in terms of election outcomes.
Yeah, we've certainly seen that, and particularly in the US, because remind our viewers, it is a non-compulsory voting system. So traditionally you have to have these big cultural issues to get people out and motivate them to actually stand in queue in lines and vote. I've seen some Republicans lament that young people, and particularly women, aren't voting for the Republican Party. Frankly, they can't win without them going into the future, but also the lamenting seems to be that, young people, women are looking at progressive issues rather than them talking about how the party needs to change. So there's a good question here on the right of politics. How do they maintain that conservatism but still speak to younger and more progressive voters? Is that possible?
Yeah, I mean, the Republicans in the US are in a real bind here. I mean, it's been well documented how they're sort of squeezed between the politics of Trump and the politics of more sort of orthodox republicanism. But the other thing that the recent elections in the US revealed is actually that there's more of a left-wing bias amongst the voter base over there, amongst the population, than elections actually often reveal. And you point to the fact, of course, that because voting is not compulsory. But when you actually poll the issues in the United States, you actually get a more kind of left or progressive leaning or bias than otherwise might be the case. The documentary filmmaker Michael Moore, for example, has really focused on this quite a lot in some of his work in relation to the gun debate and some other issues. But that's where we've seen in these recent midterm elections in the States, the fact that, women's reproductive health rights has become really predominant and really a big advantage to the Democrats, despite the unpopularity of the president. But similarly, relieving student loans and, again, some of the issues in relation to infrastructure.
Tom, and this hasn't been pulled apart that much, but abortion rights in the US became a massive issue. And I felt like the Republicans and Conservatives were seeing this through, this is the domain of unmarried women, younger women who want an abortion, whereas the Democrats took a more macro approach and was like a bit more tapped in, I think, to younger people and women in particular, not wanting an abortion, not having that binary choice, but seeing this as a more fundamental right.
And indeed, you even saw that where there were Republicans, senior Republicans like Governor DeSantis in Florida, that took a bit more of a moderate, he's still very much on the right of the Republican Party, but on the issue of abortion and reproductive rights, he took a more moderate position than the sort of Trump-style Republicans, and he was rewarded for it, obviously. But to bring this back into our domestic context, one of the things that the Conservative side of politics here in Australia really needs to figure out is basically millennial voters. So again, I'm in Melbourne at the moment, and there's a lot of focus now emerging obviously on the Victorian state election. One of the big challenges that Matthew Guy and the Liberals have is that they're basically only securing the vote of about 1 in 5 millennial voters. And millennial voters now constitute in Greater Melbourne, if not the state of Victoria, in Greater Melbourne, where of course most of the population and seats are, millennial voters are now actually the biggest bloc. They've just overtaken baby boomers as the biggest demographic cohort in this election. So if Matthew Guy, not suggesting that there's any sort of policies as extreme as what you're seeing on the Republican side when it comes to women's reproductive rights, but it's just to say that clearly there's a lot of progressive issues that appeal to millennial voters. And unless the Conservative side of politics here, in the same way that Republicans need to deal with this in the US, figure out philosophically how they're going to resolve this conflict, there's effectively a demographic blocking of Conservatives in a state like Victoria in getting back in power, irrespective of how popular Premier Andrews and the Labor government are after a few terms in office.
Yeah, and what the US has taught us, a couple of elections taught us now, is that polling does not get it right most of the time, it would seem now, because it's becoming more and more difficult to poll. Tom, we'll have to leave it there. Thanks so much for that.